Have you ever believed that the most powerful voices in the world come only from those born into privilege? The diplomats in perfect suits, the polished accents, the countries that never have to beg for help? What if I told you that one of the most unforgettable speeches ever heard inside the United Nations chamber came from a man who once treated patients in a flooded clinic, where electricity was a luxury and hope was often the only medicine left? For years, there's been a silent prejudice, never spoken too loudly, but always there. It lingers in the whispers of global conferences, in the subtle smiles of journalists who think they already know the hierarchy of nations. It's the idea that Filipinos are too emotional, too religious, too small to lead. It's whispered as if the world had agreed long ago that the Philippines could serve, could smile, could survive, but never stand at the podium of power. Even one of Harvard's most respected professors once wrote, "The Philippines has resilience, but not influence." That line became a quiet insult dressed as a compliment, and few dared to question it. Until one man did. His name was Dr. Miguel Santiago, a humanitarian physician born in the fishing town of Batangas, where the sea taught him early that survival is not about strength, but surrender to grace. He wasn't the kind of man who belonged in diplomatic circles. He had no family name engraved in the halls of politics. His hands were the hands of a doctor who had held too many dying patients, and his clothes still carried the faint smell of antiseptic from the small hospital in Leyte, where he volunteered after Typhoon Haiyan. In 2023, when the world was still recovering from the pandemic and global trust had crumbled, the United Nations Human Rights Council invited him as a community health observer. No one paid much attention. His speech wasn't on the official highlights. He wasn't even supposed to speak that day. Not officially. The delegate from a larger country had canceled at the last minute, and protocol required that someone fill the slot. A Filipino doctor with no diplomatic training was the only one available. In the cold blue light of that assembly hall, surrounded by the flags of 193 nations, Dr. Miguel looked almost out of place. He wasn't tall. His barong was modest, a gift from a patient's family who had hand-embroidered the edges. The interpreter seated beside him whispered, "Keep it short." But Miguel smiled faintly and said, "Don't worry, I'm only here to tell the truth." At that moment, nobody knew that within minutes, silence would fall across the entire room. Not the tense silence of politics, but the kind that comes when the soul is caught off guard. But before that moment, Miguel had walked a long road to get there. Years earlier, he had watched his father die from an illness that could have been cured, if only medicine had reached their small town in time. That loss carved a wound in him so deep, it became a compass. He studied medicine not out of ambition, but vengeance against despair. Yet when the pandemic hit, he found himself in the same hopelessness his patients once felt, hospitals overwhelmed, doctors quitting, faith fading. He remembered nights holding a child who couldn't breathe, whispering prayers instead of promises. And yet, even as global systems collapsed, it was ordinary Filipinos, the nurses, janitors, caregivers, who kept showing up, smiling through the masks, humming hymns as they disinfected rooms. That quiet courage became Miguel's obsession. "The world doesn't understand," he once told a colleague. "They think we're weak because we cry. But maybe our tears are proof that we still feel what others have forgotten. Compassion." And now, by a strange twist of fate, he stood before the United Nations, about to turn that idea into a weapon of truth. When his name was called, a few diplomats continued typing on their phones. A camera operator adjusted his lens lazily. To them, he was just another minor speaker from a developing country, expected to thank donors, mention resilience, and leave. But Miguel didn't open his notes. He simply placed his hands on the podium, looked around the hall, and began with a single sentence that froze the room. My country has been called poor, he said softly. Yet when the world was dying, it was our people who cared for yours. The translator paused, unsure whether to continue. The audience lifted their heads. He went on, each word deliberate, almost trembling but steady. You sent your sick to our hospitals. You called our nurses when your own gave up. You prayed for vaccines while our priests prayed for you. You spoke of global compassion. But we lived it, not in policy, but in pain. A journalist from Europe lowered his pen. Delegates leaned forward. Miguel's accent, clear but raw, echoed off the marble. There was no anger, no performance, only truth carried by a trembling heart. He ended that opening minute not with a demand, but a question. So I ask this council today, what is power if not the courage to care? For the first time in years, applause broke the silence of the UN hall before the chair could even respond. It wasn't loud, it was human. And in that fragile sound, something had shifted. They never expected this from a Filipino. But the world was about to listen. Long before the world saw Dr. Miguel Santiago standing at that marble podium in Geneva, there was a time when he thought he would never leave the Philippines at all. His journey wasn't shaped by opportunity, but by loss, by the quiet wars that happen in the hearts of those who refuse to give up. The world saw a doctor, his country saw a servant, but Miguel always saw himself as a witness to both suffering and grace. He was born in 1982 in a coastal village that was neither rich nor poor, just forgotten. His father was a fisherman who believed that prayer could heal the sea, and his mother, a schoolteacher, taught children how to dream beyond the horizon they could see. When the pandemic arrived, his father was already gone, another casualty of neglect, not of war or plague, but of poverty that steals life slowly. Miguel had just turned 40, managing a rural hospital that had one ventilator for an entire district. When COVID reached their shores, there was no protocol, no backup, no help from the capital. Only fear. He wrote in his journal one night, "When there is no medicine left, we become the medicine." And that was what he did. He became hope for others, even when he no longer had it for himself. But the cost was unbearable. Within months, he lost colleagues, doctors he had trained with, nurses who had shared lunch with him in the corridors. He saw their names appear on Facebook memorials faster than he could say a prayer. Another frontliner, another hero. The words began to lose meaning, because what they needed was not applause, but oxygen. By mid-2021, Miguel had grown bitter. He began to question everything, the system, the leaders, even God. He saw nations hoard vaccines while Filipino volunteers were mocked for begging on international calls. "So this is the world we're saving," he muttered one evening as he stitched a wound under candlelight. He applied to several international organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières, WHO field units, even hospitals in Japan and the Middle East, hoping to leave the chaos behind. One by one, his applications were declined. Some said his credentials were too local. Others simply never replied. He would later say that rejection was his real teacher. That year, in the middle of the worst wave, a small community church in Leyte asked him to help set up a temporary clinic for families displaced by floods. It wasn't a glamorous assignment. There were no cameras, no international funding, only faith and rice donations from neighbors. Miguel didn't want to go, but something about the priest's message moved him. "They have no one else," the priest wrote. "Maybe it's not about saving them. Maybe it's about being with them." And so he went. The journey to the village took 2 days, by bus and one by boat. When he arrived, the clinic was nothing more than a tent. Inside, barefoot children slept beside their mothers. The smell of damp wood and sickness hung in the air. For the first time, Miguel didn't feel like a doctor. He felt like a man stripped of everything but purpose. That night, as rain beat down on the tent roof, an old woman approached him. Her name was Liza. She handed him a cup of rice porridge and said in Filipino, "You are tired, Doc, but remember, God never sends us where He will not walk with us." That simple act, one bowl of rice, one quiet sentence, broke something inside him. He had been chasing positions, validation, escape. Yet in that moment, surrounded by people who had lost everything, he felt seen. He stayed for months, no salary, no official recognition. He treated infections, delivered babies, prayed with the dying. Slowly, word spread about the doctor who never left. Reporters came once, took photos, and moved on. But the people stayed. They began calling the clinic Bahay ng Liwanag, House of Light. When the pandemic subsided, international organizations began visiting communities to collect stories of recovery. A small UN field team came to Leyte to study grassroots responses. They found Miguel working barefoot in the mud, teaching local teenagers how to clean wounds. "We heard you've been leading a medical unit," the UN coordinator said. Miguel laughed softly. "Leading? No, I'm just trying not to lose anyone today." They filmed a short segment, barely 3 minutes long, and moved on. He thought nothing of it. Months later, that footage circulated online. It showed him holding a newborn and saying, "If we can still love in times like these, then maybe humanity isn't sick, just tired." The clip reached Geneva. Someone at the UN called it a rare voice of moral clarity. And that's how the invitation came. At first, he thought it was a mistake, a letter embossed with the UN seal addressed to Dr. Miguel Santiago, Bahay ng Liwanag Community Clinic. The words felt surreal. "You are invited to represent community-led humanitarian response at the 2023 Human Rights Council Assembly." He hesitated. "Why me?" he asked the priest who had once convinced him to stay. The old man smiled. "Because they've heard your silence, and it's louder than their speeches." As Miguel prepared to leave the Philippines for the first time, he felt the same fear he had seen in his patient's eyes, the fear of being unseen, misunderstood, dismissed. He packed his barong, a small crucifix, and a photo of the clinic children waving at him on his last day. On the plane, as clouds swallowed the horizon, he whispered a line from Scripture. "Out of the poor he shall lift a voice." He didn't know then that the world was waiting, not for another diplomat, but for a man who had lived the pain the rest only debated. And somewhere in Geneva, an empty speaking slot was waiting for him to arrive. The morning Miguel arrived in Geneva, the sky was colorless, gray like polished stone, quiet like a cathedral before Mass. He had never seen a city so clean, so ordered, so perfectly distant from the chaos he came from. The air smelled of wealth and coffee. Everyone walked quickly, eyes fixed on invisible destinations. For the first time in his life, Miguel felt small, not because of who he was, but because of where he was not. He was far from the hum of tricycles, from children shouting, "Doc, Doc," across muddy streets, from the warm chaos that gave him strength. The UN had arranged a modest hotel room overlooking the Rhone River. On the desk lay a welcome packet, maps, schedules, guidelines. It read, "Speakers are advised to maintain neutrality and professionalism. Emotional statements are discouraged." He read that line 3 times. Neutrality, professionalism. He smiled bitterly. For 3 years, he had held hands with the dying. He had wiped tears from faces that no camera would ever record. Neutrality was a language he no longer knew how to speak. The next morning, a press officer escorted him through the glass doors of the United Nations building. cameras flashed. Security guards nodded politely. Somewhere above him hung the flag of the Philippines, modest among giants. He stood beneath it for a moment, whispering, "For you." As he rehearsed his short address, he realized he couldn't just talk about his clinic. He wanted to speak about why it existed, about what made those villagers in Leyte keep living when logic told them not to. He remembered the night he had walked through the rain to deliver medicine to a child named Anna. Her mother waiting under a flickering lamp. They had no roof, no bed, just a mat on the floor. When he arrived drenched, the mother smiled and said, "Doc, thank you. We prayed you'd come." It wasn't just gratitude. It was faith dressed as survival. That faith was the essence of his country. Later that day, in a small cafe near the UN Plaza, he met a delegate from Kenya, a woman named Amara. She had heard of him from the viral video months earlier. "You're the Filipino doctor, yes?" she asked. "The one from the flood?" Miguel nodded shyly. She leaned in and said, "You know, your people, they never stop smiling, even when everything is broken. How do you do it?" Miguel didn't know how to answer. After a pause, he said quietly, "Maybe we don't smile because we're happy. Maybe we smile because we refuse to lose kindness." Amara looked at him for a long moment and whispered, "Then maybe that's the medicine the world needs." That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, watching the city lights shimmer on the river. The world beyond the glass looked so peaceful, so sterile. He thought of the Philippines, the noise, the laughter, the storms, the prayers. He realized something. The strength of his country wasn't in its wealth or power, but in its wounds. Filipinos had learned to turn pain into empathy, loss into laughter, and faith into fuel. That was what he wanted to tell the world. The following day, the session began. Delegates from every continent filled the grand chamber. Flags lined the hall like silent witnesses to history. Miguel took his assigned seat, row 32, section C. He looked around and felt that he didn't belong. Yet, as he adjusted his barong, his fingers brushed the small cross he wore on a cord around his neck, and a quiet peace settled in. During the morning discussions, country after country presented their reports, charts, statistics, carefully worded statements about development and recovery. They spoke of numbers. He thought of faces. They mentioned policies. He remembered prayers whispered in candlelight. At noon, as the chair announced a break, an assistant approached Miguel. "Sir, the delegate from Belgium has cancelled. There's a vacant slot in the next session. Would you like to speak?" He froze. "Today?" "Yes, in 20 minutes. Miguel's heart pounded. He hadn't prepared a speech worthy of that stage, but maybe that was the point. The Philippines never needed perfection to move hearts, only sincerity. He looked once more at the flag, then whispered, "For those who cannot speak." When he walked up to the podium, every insecurity followed him. The poverty of his past, the accent he could never erase, the memories of failure. But then, in his mind, he saw faces. Liza with her rice porridge, little Anna breathing softly after the storm, the volunteers praying before each shift. He stood taller. The microphone buzzed, cameras adjusted. He looked out at the rows of diplomats, reporters, ambassadors. Then, with the calmness of a man who had already lost everything except truth, he began. He didn't start with greetings or titles. Instead, he said, "I come from a country that many of you know only when disaster strikes. You call us resilient. You send aid, and we say thank you. But today, I want to ask you something different. When will the world stop thanking us for surviving and start learning why we do?" The translator hesitated, unsure how to translate the emotion behind his words. Miguel waited. Silence stretched across the room like a held breath. He continued, "In the Philippines, we have learned that resilience is not a choice. It is our inheritance. We have cried, we have buried our dead, we have rebuilt the same homes that the wind took away. And yet, every morning our people wake up, cook rice, share what little they have, and smile. Not because we forget the pain, but because we refuse to surrender joy." A murmur moved through the room. Even journalists who had been half asleep began to write. Miguel's words didn't sound like a diplomat's report. They sounded like a prayer for humanity. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing deeply, remembering his mother's voice, his father's hands, the smell of the sea. Then he opened them and said softly, "If the world wants to heal, it must learn from those who have already learned to live with scars." When he stepped away from the podium, the hall was silent. And then, one by one, delegates began to stand. Not for protocol, but out of something older than politics. Respect. They never expected this from a Filipino. But what they had just witnessed wasn't a speech. It was a revelation. For a moment after Dr. Miguel Santiago stepped down, the entire United Nations chamber forgot to breathe. The sound of his footsteps echoed against marble floors, usually reserved for politics and polished rehearsals, but this time it was something else. It wasn't diplomacy that filled the air. It was truth, raw and trembling. Delegates who had survived hundreds of speeches that meant nothing now sat upright, their eyes following him like they were afraid to lose the feeling his words had awoken. Miguel didn't know what had just happened. He walked back to his seat quietly, heart still pounding, unsure whether he had broken protocol or created one. He sat down, clasped his hands, and whispered a short prayer. "Let them remember, not me, but what we stand for." Behind him, murmurs rippled like wind through dry grass. Some whispered disbelief, others awe. The chairperson finally broke the silence with a tremor in her voice. "Thank you, Dr. Santiago. The council acknowledges your testimony." She cleared her throat, visibly moved, then added words not found in any script. "We needed to hear that." A few delegates began to clap softly. It wasn't the polite, rhythmic applause that follows most speeches. It was hesitant, human, almost fragile. And then, as if a spell had broken, more hands joined. Soon the sound became steady, then strong. Cameras turned. Journalists reached for their record buttons. The applause rose, not for statistics or policy, but for the courage of one man who spoke with the voice of millions. Miguel stood, unsure what to do. He bowed his head once and gave a small, humble smile, the kind Filipinos give when words are unnecessary. That gesture alone deepened the applause. Later that day, as sessions ended and corridors filled with suits and translators, Miguel walked alone to the lobby. The same marble floors that had felt intimidating hours earlier now seemed gentler. He stood by a window overlooking the UN gardens, staring at the fluttering flags. A voice broke his solitude. "Dr. Santiago," a woman said. He turned to see Amara, the Kenyan delegate, approaching with tears in her eyes. "You spoke for all of us," she said softly. "We keep trying to prove we're strong, but you reminded us that strength isn't something to prove. It's something we live." She extended her hand, and when he shook it, others joined. Delegates from Brazil, Poland, South Korea, even Sweden. They didn't speak the same language, but the message was clear. Something had changed. That evening, in his hotel room, Miguel sat on the bed staring at his reflection. He still wore the same barong. There were sweat stains under the collar, a coffee mark near the cuff. He thought of how absurd it was. a doctor from a storm-wrecked village lecturing the most powerful nations on compassion. He laughed quietly to himself, half in disbelief, half in gratitude. His phone buzzed non-stop. Journalists requested interviews. Old friends from medical school sent messages of pride. Even strangers wrote, "You made us cry. You made us proud to be Filipino." But the message that undid him came from a number he didn't recognize. It was a photo. The children from Bahay ng Liwanag, standing in front of the small clinic, holding a cardboard sign that read, "We watched you, Doc. You made them listen." He put the phone down and wept, not for victory, but for the weight of what that moment carried. In the following days, the UN issued a short statement about recognizing the moral contribution of community-led humanitarian efforts. It was formal, distant, typical. But inside the walls of the assembly, something less visible but far more powerful had begun. A shift in tone. Speeches that once echoed with self-praise now began to speak of shared humility. Even a delegate from a first-world nation admitted privately, "That Filipino doctor reminded us that data without heart is just noise." Miguel was invited to dinner by the Secretary General himself. The setting was elegant, almost unreal. Between polished silverware and soft light, he felt out of place again. "Dr. Santiago," the secretary began, "you gave this council something we had forgotten, a reason to care." Miguel replied gently, "I only told the truth, sir." The man nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "but sometimes the truth needs someone pure enough to carry it." After the dinner, Miguel walked outside. Geneva at night shimmered like a dream. He found a small chapel near the lake, empty, quiet, lit by one candle. He knelt, resting his hands on the pew. "Lord," he whispered, "I didn't mean to be seen. I only wanted them to remember your people." He thought of the Philippines, the laughter, the prayers, the storms, and realized his country had never been small. It had only been unseen. What the world called resilience was, in truth, an act of love so consistent it became invisible. Days later, when Miguel finally boarded the flight home, he looked out the window at the clouds and thought about everything that had happened. The faces in the hall, the applause that came from disbelief, the letters flooding his inbox. But more than anything, he thought of that single sentence he had spoken. What is power, if not the courage to care? Somewhere between the heavens and the earth, he felt the answer. Power was not in command, it was in compassion. And as the plane descended toward Manila, he smiled through tears. The world might forget his name, but it would never again forget the light that came from the islands he called home. They never expected this from a Filipino. But the truth was, only a Filipino could have said it that way, with faith as soft as prayer and strength as deep as the sea. When the plane touched down at Ninoy Aquino International Airport, the cabin erupted with the usual applause Filipinos give after every safe landing, that small collective act of gratitude that somehow never grows old. But this time, when Dr. Miguel Santiago heard it, he felt it differently. The sound wasn't just about arrival, it was about return, to a land that had taught him everything worth saying. Outside, Manila pulsed with life, jeepneys honking, street vendors calling, the scent of rain mixing with exhaust. It was chaos, yes, but it was home. Reporters were waiting by the terminal gate, waving microphones. They called him the doctor who moved the United Nations. Miguel smiled nervously, his eyes tired yet kind. "I didn't move them," he said softly. "The Filipino spirit did." That humility became the headline. "A Filipino doctor's speech on compassion goes viral," read one. "From Leyte to the United Nations, the story of Dr. Miguel Santiago," said another. But Miguel didn't read the articles. Instead, he returned to the same small town that had made him, to Bahay ng Liwanag. The road was muddy as ever, the clinic walls still patched with tin sheets. When he arrived, the children ran toward him, shouting, "Doc, you're famous!" He laughed, kneeling to hug them. "No," he said, "I'm just home." Inside, Sister Liza, now older, her back slightly bent, greeted him with tears. "We watched you on television," she said. "For a moment, the world remembered us." Miguel took her hands and replied, "They didn't remember us. They remembered what we've always been, people who never stopped believing in kindness." Word of his speech spread far beyond what he imagined. Universities in Europe used his address in ethics classes. Hospitals in Canada and Italy quoted his lines about compassion. Even policymakers in Washington mentioned the Filipino doctor's challenge to redefine power. But in the Philippines, something even deeper stirred. A quiet pride, a rekindling of faith in themselves. In churches, priests mentioned him during homilies. In classrooms, teachers played recordings of his words to inspire students. Even taxi drivers began telling passengers, "Did you hear about that doctor? A Filipino made the UN cry." It wasn't vanity, it was healing. For once, the story of the Philippines wasn't about disaster or corruption, it was about dignity. Weeks later, Miguel was invited to Malacañang Palace to receive a national commendation. He hesitated at first. Ceremonies made him uncomfortable, but he went out of respect. The president, in her speech, called him the voice of a nation's soul. As cameras flashed, Miguel simply said, "If this moment honors anyone, it should honor every Filipino nurse, teacher, farmer, and mother who keeps faith alive when the world forgets to." After the event, as the hall emptied, a young student approached him shyly. "Sir," she said, "I want to be like you someday." Miguel smiled. "Then promise me one thing," he said. "Don't aim to be known. Aim to be useful. The world needs fewer heroes and more healers." In the months that followed, invitations poured in, conferences, summits, interviews, but Miguel declined most of them. Instead, he returned to building clinics across Visayas, using the donations that came after his speech. His focus remained unchanged, one patient at a time, one act of kindness at a time. But the world didn't forget. On the anniversary of his UN address, the United Nations released a short documentary titled "The Doctor Who Redefined Resilience." It wasn't about politics. It was about people. The final scene showed him standing under a mango tree outside his clinic, surrounded by laughter, saying, "The greatest speech is not made of words, but of lives restored." When asked in an interview what message he wanted the world to take from his journey, Miguel paused for a long moment. His voice, when it came, was quiet but sure. Filipinos have always been seen as survivors, but survival is not our destiny. It's our testimony. We show the world that faith can exist without comfort, that love can thrive even in loss, and that compassion is stronger than power. The world doesn't need another superpower, it needs super hearts. The interviewer, holding back tears, whispered, "Do you believe the world listened?" Miguel smiled. "They will," he said, "because love doesn't shout. It echoes." Years later, people still spoke of that day at the United Nations, the day a Filipino doctor stood before the world and reminded humanity of itself. Some said his words changed global policy. Others said they simply changed hearts. But in truth, it didn't matter which. The change had already begun in the unseen, in the way a nurse in New York now greeted patients with gentler eyes, in the way a diplomat paused before speaking harshly, in the way strangers began to see each other not as countries, but as souls. In a world that had forgotten how to feel, the Philippines had reminded it how. And in that reminder, the nation once called small became immeasurable, not in might, but in mercy. As the sun set over the Leyte coast one evening, Miguel stood outside the clinic, watching the children play. The wind carried the scent of salt and faith. He closed his eyes, listening to their laughter rise into the golden sky, and whispered the words that had started it all. What is power, if not the courage to care? The world had once expected little from a Filipino, but now it looked to the Philippines not for aid, but for answers. Answers written not in laws, but in love. And for the first time in a long, long while, humanity seemed ready to listen.